Thank you for that kind introduction, and I want to congratulate the Center on a very interesting and stimulating conference. Thank the staff who's been very helpful in facilitating, and congratulate Ephraim for either have been very courageous or very foolish to invite me. The unreliability of my analysis goes back to 1976, when I first visited the Gulf. That was years before I lived across the region on both sides of the water. But in 1976, at the age of 24, I came back and said, this can't last. I still think it can't last, although my timeline obviously has changed and a lot of circumstances have changed. And one of those circumstances certainly is the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, who is a man who draws very sharp reactions. There are many who see him as God's gift to Saudi Arabia, and there are those who see him as the devil incarnated. And the truth is probably in the middle. He's no doubt a popular figure in Saudi Arabia today, a country where the population, or more than half of the population, is below the age of 30. He understands youth aspirations in ways that the more recent octogenarian leadership of the country does not. And he understands to communicate with people in Saudi Arabia, youth in Saudi Arabia, in ways that older leaders did not. He also instinctively, at least, understands what has to change economically and socially to move the kingdom into the 21st century and to secure not only regime survival, but also its absolute grip on power. The question is whether he knows how to do it. And what makes Mohammed bin Salman's popularity fragile, in my mind, is the fact that there has been no management of expectations of the process of change. Expectations are running high. Time frames are unrealistic in terms of those expectations, and delivery is going to be the key. Bin Salman has begun to deliver socially with things like women's driving and greater entertainment opportunity. Availing oneself of those opportunities costs money, and bin Salman has yet to deliver jobs. All of this, moreover, involves rewriting the social contract unilaterally. That is what's happening, and it has sparked criticism and anger on social media when the government has failed to cushion the pain. There is a second, at least equally important aspect to the lack of management of the process of change. And that is the fact that change is not always being universally and wholeheartedly embraced. The very youth that enthusiastically supports Mohammed bin Salman, when asked whether they've thought through what the consequences of it are, turn ambiguous. To give you an example, there is a young Saudi academic who recently informally surveyed 100 young Saudi men. And he asked them, what do you want? They wanted to go party. They wanted to date girls. They wanted fast cars. And they wanted jobs. And so you ask them, so your sister's going to go date? Oh no, she isn't. Add to this fact that you have discrepancies within the kingdom between the major urban centers which most people look at, Riyadh, Jeddah, Dammam, and the secondary cities, where the responses are very different and where there is a lot more questioning, certainly of the social change, not of the economic change. The issue of conservatism goes far beyond this. It goes to bin Salman's vow to return the kingdom to some undefined form of moderate Islam. And it goes to the rivalry with Iran and the related Saudi funding globally of Sunni Muslim ultra-conservatism, which in turn goes to the core of what has been a 4 decades long covert war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as the rise of sectarianism and extremism. Conventional wisdom has it that the Al Saud's rule is dependent on its legitimization by the religious establishment. Bin Salman's power grab in recent months that amounts to a move towards one-man rule, if you wish, means that he may no longer be dependent on that, although I doubt that we're going to see a clean break with Wahhabism or with ultra-conservative Sunni Islam. That, in some ways, may be bin Salman's response to the intrinsic challenge of Iran. That challenge would exist, in my mind, even without Iran's regional moves. Iran witnessed, and I lived through that period in Tehran, more than 2 decades before the 2011 popular Arab revolts, one of the 20th century's few true revolutions. From the Saudi perspective, it was a revolution that toppled a monarch. It was a revolution that toppled an icon of the United States. And whatever one thinks of the regime in Iran and of the political system, it has aspects of sovereign legitimacy, which fundamentally questions the rule or the Islamic claim that the Al Sauds have in the kingdom as being the model of Islamic governance. Ironically, bin Salman closed down one option of maintaining religious legitimacy with the dispute with Qatar, whose form of Wahhabism is a very different one from that of the kingdom. And the Qataris will describe that, as you probably well know, as the difference between the Wahhabism of the sea versus the Wahhabism of the land. Despite Saudi Arabia's recent decision to relinquish control of the Great Mosque in Brussels because of complaints by the Belgian government and reports that bin Salman wants to put a halt to Saudi funding of ultra-conservatism internationally, the question arises how far this may go and what impact it may have. One just needs to look at parts of Yemen like Al-Mahra, or the huge amounts of money that in the last 18 months have gone into Balochistan, into ultra-conservative militant madrasas. Or the fact that a Saudi journalist was detained for questioning this week after calling for a reduction in the number of mosques in the country. What Saudi Arabia has done over the last 40 years with what I would describe as a public diplomacy, or the single largest public diplomacy campaign in history, with an estimated investment of about $100 billion. Estimates for the Soviet Union over 70 years are $7 billion. The US far lower than that for a whole bunch of reasons. A public relation campaign that was designed to promote not necessarily a political and certainly not necessarily a violent form of ultra-conservatism across the globe to counter Iranian revolutionary zeal. And what that has done, it's let a genie out of the bottle that they no longer can put back in the bottle. They no longer control. They've created something that has its own life. If you look today at Pakistani madrasas, foreign funding for Pakistani madrasas is 7% of their total income. They no longer depend on the Saudis. Let me close with one remark. I would argue that Saudi Arabia's battle, or that Saudi Arabia lost its battle with Iran on day one. Saudi Arabia's future, in my mind, is not that of a regional hegemon, but of a second fiddle state. Or in the most optimistic scenario, a Singapore, although it lacks the attributes of power, or like Singapore, that lacks the attributes of power, but knows how to compensate for that. There are three, in my mind, Middle Eastern states, plus Israel, that have the makings for regional power, irrespective of what state of disrepair they may be in today. And that's Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. All three have huge populations, huge domestic markets, deep-seated identity that goes back to empire or a perception of thousands of years of history. They have battle-hardened militaries. They have geographic location, and at least in two of the three cases, a very highly educated population. Sure, sorry. And they have, at least in two or three of the cases, a highly educated population. Saudi offers Mecca and money. It's exploiting a window of opportunity provided by U.S. containment of Iran. And that could prove to be a bet on the longer term that is not that stable.
To what extent do you think MBZ rather than MBS plays a role? To what extent does the UAE come in and mollify where MBS is going? And also, what you didn't, I guess, is it fair to focus on necessity here? I mean, after all, the Houthis are attacking Saudi Arabia. Their airport was basically bombed. If it were here in Israel, we would have been closed for 2 weeks when we had a similar incident. In Saudi Arabia, that didn't happen. So where do you see that all fitting together?
You want me to answer that?
Please.
Sure. I think obviously the relationship between MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, and Mohammed bin Salman is a very close one. I think you've got to realize that, and in the leaked emails of Yusuf Beloteba in Washington, the UAE ambassador, it was also very clearly stated that the UAE, and particularly Mohammed bin Zayed, understands that there, even to a country like the UAE, there are limits to what a small country can do. And so he has long worked through the Saudi court. And when Abdullah was dying and the battle for the succession was taking place, Mohammed bin Zayed lost out. It was his people that were among the first ones to be removed when Salman came to the throne. He's regained all of that, of course, through Mohammed bin Salman. But if you go back to the early days, the early months, maybe the first 6 to 9 months of Salman's rule, the relationship with the Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia started to change, very subtly. It was not about to be reversed. And the relationship between the Saudis and the Brotherhood, even until today, is somewhat different from that of Mohammed bin Zayed, who is viscerally opposed to the Brotherhood for a variety of reasons. Some have been publicly mentioned, some have never been publicly mentioned, including opinion polls that the Nahyans did, and very privately about popularity, their own popularity within the Emirates, and they were quite shocked with what the response to that was. I think in terms of Yemen, one's got to realize that the Houthis didn't just happen. The Saudis have had a divide and rule policy in Yemen for a very long time, and they have been as much part of the problem as part of the solution. You go back to the establishment of a Salafi missionary and school on the outskirts of Sada around 2003, 2004. So a lot of this relationship and what's happening has strong roots, part of it in Saudi policy itself. So in a sense, they're now dealing with the fallout of what has been decades of a misplaced policy.